ma'am, to start this session. So without further ado, I hand it over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Ishan, and thank you. I really thank the entire team of Center for Labor Laws for having me here. And yeah, I think if everyone is there, we can start.
Yes, ma'am, we're highly obliged.
All right. So today we will move a step further from where we were yesterday. We will try to cover the four labor codes, the upcoming labor codes. And I think I'd mentioned that yesterday also that contrary to what people have been saying about the codes, that it's a huge change in the in the labor law regime. It's not like that. It's primarily a consolidation exercise. So if you ask me whether the labor laws are more of a consolidation exercise or a reform exercise, I would say that it's the former. So, but yes, there are few notable changes that we can elaborate upon in today's session. So, moving on to the next slide, which talks about the roadmap. So, this is just for your information that what the central government did is after like between 2019 and 2020, it introduced the four bills in the parliament, and without much debate, these were passed. And that is also one of the criticisms with respect to the labor codes, that the opposition was never given a chance to debate on these codes. But anyway, these were passed swiftly in parliament, and then the president gave his assent to the four labor codes. So after that exercise was done, it was concluded in September 2020. After that, the central government began the process of the rule making exercise. So, like I said yesterday, both the central and the state governments have the power to come up with rules. Uh, yes, the central government has greater powers. There are certain items on which only the central government can come up with rules or notifications. But yes, both have to work on these codes. And the central government did its part. It released the draft rules for public consultation. In fact, in Khaitan also, this I'll discuss when we'll talk about my professional journey. That we not only advise our clients, we also advise the government. So we were part of the consultation exercise. We sent our recommendations to the government that these are the changes that you can introduce in the draft rules. So that entire exercise completed this year in January, and now the central government officials are saying that they are done with finalizing the rules, the central rules, but the state governments have not been forthcoming. So state governments are still working upon the draft rules. Only 4 5 states like Maharashtra, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, only these 4 5 states have come up with draft rules for public consultation. Other states have not even released draft rules. So the earlier prediction was, the earlier statement of the ministry was that the labor codes will come into effect on 1st April 2021. But given how slow the process has been, if the state rules aren't there, how will they implement the codes? So they are really pushing the state governments to come forward, but they are anticipating that this will cause a 2 month delay, also because of the state assembly elections that are happening everywhere. So the focus of the state governments is on the assembly elections and not the codes at all. So that is another thing that you can bear in mind. Only one set of provisions have been brought into effect so far. These relate to Central Advisory Board. So under the Code on Wages, I'll come to that subsequently. Under the Code on Wages 2019, there is a provision regarding constituting a Central Advisory Board. So what this board will do, essentially, it will help the central government in deciding what the minimum wage rates should be. So it's basically an advisory consultative kind of a board that the central government constitutes. It's there even under the existing regime, and it will be constituted under the new codes as well. So what they've done is that they have brought into effect these provisions regarding central advisory board. But yes, it's not a very material provision in the larger scheme of things. So most of the things have not been implemented. So moving on to the next slide. Now, we will talk about the Code on Wages 2019. Next slide. Yeah. So one important thing, and we can appreciate the government for doing this, is that they have basically come up with a uniform definition of wages. So the 4 labor codes have exactly the same definition of wages. It basically says that wages is something, it's basically a promised payment that you make to the employees under the contract in return for fulfillment of the terms of employment by the employee. So when the employee does his part, his or her part, which is rendering the services, so in return for that, whatever payment that the employer has promised under the employment contract, that would be wages. So when I say promised payments, obviously I'm not talking about something like performance bonus, right? It's not a promised payment that I'm making to the employee. Basically, when I talk about promise payment, I'm talking about those payments which will have to be paid in return for the bare minimum work that the employee has to do, the required job that the employee has to do. So if the employee in the factory is required to produce 100 units in a particular month, so for those 100 units, whatever that employee will get, that would be wages. So if the employee ends up producing 200 units, and in return for that, I'm paying something extra, that is not wages. Okay, so that is one important thing that you need to keep in mind. Contingent payments will also not be considered as wages, again for the same reason that they are not promised. For example, you will see in a lot of factories there's a payment called night shift allowance. Now that payment is made only when the employee actually works in night shift. If he or she is not working in night shifts, that payment will not be made. So the night shift allowance will not be wages. Okay. Likewise, discretionary payments, again, very much like the performance bonus. These are also discretionary in nature. These payments will again not form part of wages. Now, one of the clients reached out to us asking if ESOPs can be considered as wages. So I'm not sure if you're aware of the concept, but broadly speaking, employee stock options are basically, some options given to employees to incentivize them to continue with the company for a certain period of time. And once they complete that requisite period, they are given a chance to convert these options into equity shares and, have some stake in the company. So one question was asked to us that whether ESOPs would be part of wages. Answer was simple. Again, it's a contingent, event. If I am completing that 4-5 years of service, only then will I be given those ESOPs, right? So, or I will be able to convert those ESOPs. So that is why we say that because there is a contingency element there, and also because it's performance based most of the time, so you cannot consider ESOP as wages. Okay, so that's the broad idea. Let me tell you, this definition has been borrowed from the existing labor laws only. There's no change. It's just that they have compiled the definition, and there are certain exclusions from the definition of wages. For example, house rent allowance that you pay to the employees, that has been excluded. Then overtime has been excluded from the definition of wages. Even commission that these sales employees get for meeting certain targets, though that commission has also been expressly excluded from the definition of wages. So what they've done is, under different labor laws, you have different exclusions from the definition. So they've compiled those exclusions in a way. So that is the important thing here. Moving on to the next slide. All right. This is a very interesting provision. Okay, you will not find this in any of the existing labor laws. What this provision says, that there's a proviso to the definition of wages, which basically says that if the wages bucket in the overall remuneration, like I said, in the overall remuneration, there can be various things. Other than wages, my remuneration can also consist of performance bonus. It can also consist of house rent allowance, which has been expressly excluded from wages, but it can be part of my overall remuneration, right? I'll be receiving that amount. It's just that it will not be treated as wages, right? So the remuneration is a larger term, and within that you have the concept of wages, which is a slightly narrow term. So what the labor codes say now is that if this wages bucket is less than 50% of the overall remuneration, then you will take out some portion from the expressly excluded components, add them to the wages bucket so that the wages become at least 50% of the remuneration. So I know this sounds a bit convoluted, but I've tried to present this by way of an example. So if you see on your screen, the wages bucket will have basic salary, it will have BNS allowance, medical allowance, education allowance, random allowances that the employee gets. All those are considered as wages and they total up to 9,000 rupees. Now we have a house rent allowance and conveyance allowance, which have been expressly excluded from the definition of wages, right? So they total up to 11,000. So my overall remuneration comes to 20,000, right? But the wages bucket is 9,000. It's less than 50% of the overall remuneration. It should have been 10,000, but it's 9,000 set by the employer. So what the codes say is that for all purposes, we will treat wages to be 50% of the remuneration. So for all purposes, wages would be considered as 10,000 and not 9,000. Okay. Why have they come up with this provision? They have basically, like I mentioned in the previous session also, there are various computations that happen on wages. You know, the social security contributions will be calculated on wages, right? Even overtime. What is overtime? Overtime is basically twice the amount of wages that I get, right? So if I'm doing extra work, I'll be paid overtime at the rate of twice the wages that I get. So everywhere, you know, all these computations are made on wages. So what the government has tried to do is they have ensured that these wages are maintained at a certain level, you know. So they have said that, okay, you call wages to be 20%, 30% of remuneration, we don't care. But for computation purposes, whatever benefits that you have to give to the employee, all those will be computed at 50% of the remuneration. Okay, so that's the idea. So of course, if the wages are already more than 50% of the remuneration, then of course every computation, social security contributions, overtime, everything will be calculated on those actual wages. Okay, so in this example, if we turn things around and assume that excluded components are 9,000 and wages is 11,000, which is more than 50%, then we will calculate all the contributions, everything on that 11,000 rupees. Then that proviso will not become applicable. So the proviso basically becomes applicable where the wages bucket is less than 50% of the overall remuneration. Okay? So that's the idea. Important provision indeed. It will ensure that employees, benefits are not computed at a small, minuscule amount. So that's the intention behind this proviso. Moving on to the next slide. Okay, so now I'll quickly discuss other important changes. So in the last session, I'd mentioned that Payment of Wages Act applies primarily to factories, mines, plantations. It doesn't apply to commercial establishments. So when I say commercial establishment, I'm basically talking about service sector industries, okay, which are not involved in manufacturing activities. So of course, service sector constitutes a major chunk of, the employing class, right? It's one of the major employers in India. So what the government did is that the Payment of Wages chapter under the Code on Wages has been extended to apply to every kind of establishment, whether it's factory, whether it's commercial establishment. This chapter will apply to all employers. Another important change is that this also I had mentioned in the previous session, that Payment of Wages Act applies only to employees who are earning wages up to 24,000 rupees. Now they have done away with that wage ceiling. So basically, the Payment of Wages chapter under the code will apply to all employees. Now here, there's an interesting, catch. Basically, all these managerial senior level employees, the CEOs and the managing directors, right? Now, even they would be considered as, covered under this chapter. So what, this chapter talks about, it talks about the time by which you need to disburse wages, and the kinds of deductions that you can make from wages, right? These are the things that are covered under Payment of Wages Act, right? So that those same provisions will are also covered in the chapter on payment of wages. So now, remember in the previous session, I had mentioned that you can make different deductions from an employee's wages, but those deductions cannot exceed 50% of the wages, right? So even now, for a managing director who may be earning, I don't know, in lakhs per month, for them also this provision now will become applicable. That if I'm making deductions from an MD's salary, I will have to ensure that those deductions do not exceed 50% of the MD's wages, right? So, a lot of times, and this is going to become a problem for employers, because what they do is, for these senior level employees, they have different deductions that they make from their wages, right? Their salary. For example, if a senior level employee leaves the organization early, okay, he may have received a joining bonus at the time of joining, and he may have been told that, look, you will have to complete 5 years. If you leave early, then you will have to pay back whatever joining bonus that we paid to you. So now employers will have to be cautious, because now they cannot deduct that joining bonus amount from the employee's wages, right? And basically, because there are only certain deductions which are permissible, and joining bonus is not considered as one of those permissible deductions. So basically, employers' discretion to deduct different payments from wages of these senior level people, that has been curtailed to a certain extent. So yeah, that's the idea. Basically, this chapter will apply to all establishments and all employees. Second important change is the concept of floor wages. So, like I had mentioned in the previous session, every state government comes up with its own minimum wage notification, right? It sets its own minimum wage rates that the employer has to comply with. But now what will happen is, the central government will come up with its own floor wage. So basically, it will say that I set 10,000 rupees as the floor wage, 10,000 per month as the floor wage. Now, what the state governments will have to do is, they can obviously come up with their own minimum wage rates, but those have to match at least the floor wage that the central government has set, right? They can set a higher minimum wage rate, no problem, but they cannot fix a rate that is lower than the floor wage, okay? And the central government may set different floor wages for different states also. So it could be one national floor wage, or it could be different floor wages for different states. And ideally, what we are expecting is that there would be different floor wages, because, I mean, you cannot have the same floor wage for Maharashtra and Bihar, right? So that is an important change. So it will kind of ensure parity to a certain extent. And the last is very, very important, compounding of offenses. Till now, most of the labor laws did not have a provision for compounding of offenses. This is a major benefit for employers, because now they can actually compound, certain offenses. So under Code on Wages, all the offenses which are not punishable with imprisonment, they can be compounded. So if the fine is, let's say, 1 lakh rupees, so up to 50% I can compound. Okay, so this concept, although I've mentioned only in the Code on Wages slide and not in other slides, but this compounding offense has been introduced in all the labor codes. Okay, only for the serious offenses, compounding will not be available, but for the most part, compounding is available. Another important provision is that there is a facility for rectification of offenses. So today, if the employer commits any offense, it will not be immediately prosecuted. What the authorities will do is, they will issue a notice, say that, look, we have found that you have violated this provision under the code. We are giving you 15 days to rectify it. So if the employer manages to rectify within 15 days, then the employer will not be prosecuted. So, of course, it's not available each time the employer commits an offense. There is a cooling off period also of 3-5 years. So if another offense is committed of a similar kind and within 3 years again, then this facility is not available. So obviously the employers cannot think that they can just keep on violating the provisions. That's not the idea. But yes, to a certain extent, the labor codes are a facilitative regime. They will constitute a facilitative regime allowing for compliance with the law. So they are focusing this time less on prosecution, but more on compliance. Okay. So this is it with respect to code on wages. Let's move to the next one. Yeah.
Ma'am, a
So code
question.
on,
If you
yeah,
So, ma'am, I have a question on the concept of compounding of offenses. So,
right.
ma'am, as you mentioned, if the punishment is a fine of rupees 1 lakh,
Mhm.
50% would be compounded. Ma'am, how that 50,000 would be compounded? And because it is not in, I think, consonance with the concept of compounding as present in the criminal law.
Mhm.
Or is it a bit different from that? Will you please elucidate that as well? That if it is different, how it is different?
Yes, so it's not exactly the same as the criminal law regime. Basically, whatever maximum fine there is with respect to any offense under the codes, so you can compound up to 50% for certain provisions. In certain, I mean, if you talk about code on social security and occupational safety code, so for certain offenses, you can compound even up to 75% of the maximum fine that is prescribed for that offense. Okay, so what will the employer do in that case? Basically, the employer will make an application to the local authority acknowledging that yes, there is an offense on my part, but I would like to compound it. And then of course the local authority will take cognizance of that, and then they will kind of allow a certain amount period of time within which they need to deposit that compounding fee. The employer needs to deposit the compounding fee. So it could be either, so depending on the offense that we are talking about, it could be either 50% of the maximum fine or 75% of the maximum fine that it will have to deposit with the authorities. So that's the idea. With respect to compounding, we need to still see how this entire framework is going to work, because the codes only talk about the percentage, like 50%, 75%, which I can compound. But how will this process work out? Everything will be prescribed under the rules. And we do not have the rules in front of us right now. They are yet to be finalized. So we need to see how this framework is built. But this is the idea behind compounding. Okay? So, okay, so social security,
Hello, madam.
one of the most, uh, one of the most important laws. Can I request everyone to please mute themselves? Okay, great. So, Code on Social Security, one of the most important codes. This is going to replace 9 existing central labor laws. Okay, first of all, I think I didn't mention this in Code on Wages, that uh, overall, the 4 codes taken together, they are going to replace 29 central labor laws. You will see in a lot of articles that basically they are saying that 44 central labor laws will be repealed. That's incorrect. Only 29 central labor laws are going to be replaced through these 4 codes. Okay, so always remember that. And it's only the central laws which are going to be repealed. The state laws, like for example, so the state laws like shops and establishment statute, they will continue to be applicable to establishments. It's only the 29 central laws which are going to be replaced. So under Code on Social Security, 9 of those 29 labor laws are going to be replaced. And these are basically Employees Provident Fund, Employees State Insurance Fund, gratuity, maternity. All these provisions are going to be replaced by Code on Social Security. Okay? So let's move to the next slide. Okay. So important change in the definition of employee. So if you see the EPF Act and the ESI Act, these acts include contract workers also within the definition of employee. So a principal employer has to ensure, I hope that you guys remember whatever we discussed about contract labor. Like I had mentioned, contract labor is not your own, they are not your own employees. They are the employees of the contractor who is supplying these contract labors to you for different activities. So contract labor ideally should be the employees of the contractor and not me. But because we are talking about social security, which is such a sacrosanct benefit, they have, under EPF Act and ESI Act included contract labor also within the definition of employee. So Of course, the primarily liability to, the responsibility to make these contributions rests with the contractor, of course. But if the contractor fails to make these social security contributions, then the liability can fall on the principal employer also. Okay. So this idea has been written under the codes as well. But for gratuity, there is an important change. Under Payment of Gratuity Act, employee did not cover contract labor. But now even the gratuity chapter, which so far only was limited to employees, now it will cover contract labor also. So if a contract labor services are terminated today and gratuity has to be paid, contractor fails to pay, the contract labor can actually approach the principal employer and demand that gratuity from the principal employer. Okay, and while the chapters on Provident Fund and Employees State Insurance Fund under the code have this provision regarding recovery, which basically say that, if the principal employer makes those contributions, then it can recover that amount from the contractor, right? Why? Because contractor is actually the employer of these contract labor. So why is principal employer bearing that liability? So principal employer has the option of recovering whatever amount it had to pay from the contractor. But unfortunately, this provision does not exist under the chapter on gratuity under the code. So if the principal employer had to pay gratuity to the contract labor, it cannot go to the contractor and say that, look, I had to pay this amount. You have to pay me back whatever I had to pay to the contract labor. So provision is not there under the gratuity chapter. So this is one of the reasons why a lot of industries are, reaching out to the government and saying, please, include this provision under gratuity chapter also, because it's going to increase our costs. So this is important. This is an important change. One of the most important changes, I would say, under Code on Social Security is recognition of fixed term employment. Now, it's not that fixed term employment doesn't exist under the existing regime, but it has not been statutorily recognized as a concept. Okay. Only in 1 or 2 statutes, you will see a mention of fixed term employment, but mostly this provision, this concept is not expressly recognized. So what is fixed term employment? As the term suggests, if I'm engaging or employing a person for a limited duration, and that duration has been specified in the contract, that would be fixed term employment. So normally what happens is, when I was given a job by Khaitan, they didn't mention that I will be employed only for 2 years or 3 years. It's basically, okay, anyway, this is not the right example because I'm anyway not the employee of Khaitan, but okay, let's take some other example. And basically what happens is that normally in the contract, there will be no period specified. Normally you will see a permanent employment. So until either of the parties terminates the contract will continue forever. Okay. But fixed term employment there is a period specified in the contract, and that is the limited amount of time for which the employee has to render services. So what the government realizes that employers are, even for a job that requires a permanent employee, they basically engage fixed term employees, and they will say in their contract that, look, I'm engaging you only for 2 years. And then what will they do? They'll keep on renewing the contract again and again and again. So essentially that fixed term employee is the permanent employee only, but in the contract, it's being shown that that person is engaged only for 2 years, then the contract expires, then a fresh contract is entered into, and the cycle continues. So what happens as a result of that is, so far, for certain benefits like gratuity, these provisions were not available to a fixed term employee. Why? Because I mentioned in the previous session that gratuity is available only if the employee has completed 4 years and 240 days, right? So if in my contract, it's written that I will be engaged only for 2 years, and then each time my contract is getting renewed, on paper, it's being basically shown that after 2 years, my contract, there's a break in my service and there's a fresh employment. So my previous 2 years will not be counted. So by that logic, I will never meet the eligibility criterion for receiving gratuity. I will never be able to complete 4 years, even though I may have actually worked for the employer for 15 years, right? So that was the misuse a lot of abuse that was happening at the hands of the employer. And that is why what the code on social security says is that, okay, no problem, engage employees on fixed term basis. We are not prohibiting that, but all the benefits which are available to a permanent employee have to be given to fixed term employee also on a prorated basis. Okay, so jitna time fixed term employee spend karta hai in the organization, he or she will get even gratuity. So the interesting thing here is that if a fixed term employee does not even complete 4 years and 240 days, which is the eligibility criterion to get gratuity, still, even after completing 1 year or 2 years, the person will become entitled for gratuity. And of course, gratuity will be available to him on a prorated basis. Jitna time spent kiya, utna gratuity that person will get. So basically now fixed term employees have got a special privilege vis-a-vis a permanent employee. A permanent employee has to complete 4 years and 240 days to get gratuity. But a fixed term employee, even after completing 1 year and resigning from services, will get gratuity on a prorated basis. So it's a protection that fixed term employees have got now. And this will basically prevent employers from abusing the provisions by employing someone on a fixed term basis. Okay? So that's an interesting concept that you should know. Then this is basically relevant for employers. The third point, they have introduced a limitation period, and authorities cannot harass the employers by, basically initiating prosecution after 15, 20 years. And we see that in practice a lot, that whenever there are some dues with respect to EPF or ESI, authorities will stay silent. And one fine day after 15, 20 years, they will issue a notice to the employer saying that, look, these are the dues. You have to pay these interest, pay these dues along with interest and damages. So, of course, it is kind of a hassle, harassment also at the hands of the authorities. So now the courts have, and I would say it's a very good provision that they have introduced a limitation period, which is 5 years from the date when these dues these payments become due. So authorities can only approach within that 5-year period. After that, the limitation period will cease. Okay, so that's an important provision. Another thing is with respect to common creche. Now, this is again very beneficial for employers. So far, every employer had to set up a creche facility. Okay, if it had 50 or more employees, it had to set up a creche facility under Maternity Benefit Act. And the problem is that when we are talking about employers in storied buildings, it's very difficult to set up a creche facility. If any one of you has come to Khaitan's office or any other office in Lower Parel, especially in Mumbai, you will realize that the space is, it's just so limited that you cannot really set up a creche facility in your premises. So what the code has allowed for is that different employers can pool in their resources and set up a common creche facility. So for example, if there is a 13-storied building, each story has a different employer. All the employees in that building can come together and pool in their resources to set up a common creche. Not only that, they can also reach out to a third-party agency that runs creche facilities and ask them to provide creche facility for their own employees. Okay, so that common creche facility concept has been introduced. This was not there under the existing regime. And last but not the least, gig workers and platform workers. I'm sure every one of you, has been waiting to understand what these two concepts are. So, broadly speaking, these two concepts are not very different. So, gig worker basically means a person who performs work outside of the traditional employer-employee relationship. Okay, so even for that matter, a platform worker also performs work outside of the traditional employer-employee relationship, right? So to that extent, the gig workers and the platform workers are the same. But in the definition of platform worker, there's another important provision, which is basically that a platform worker is one who is engaged by an organization which has an online platform. Okay, this organization will have an online platform where the platform worker will render its services for a third person. Okay, like for example, if we talk about Urban Company, so Urban Company here has an online platform, right? And it will engage certain people as platform workers, and these platform workers will render services for third persons. Okay, so because there's an online platform here, these people who are rendering services are not only gig workers, but they're also platform workers, to be specific, right? But if there is no online platform as such, but this, but everything else remains the same, then we can say that that person is not a platform worker, but just a gig worker. So basically, the distinction is only with respect to existence of an online platform where these people are providing their services or through which they are providing their services. So that's the minimal distinction between gig worker and platform worker. But like I said, these categories of people do not have an employer-employee relationship with the organization that is engaging them. So, of course, there have been petitions filed by, the cab drivers of Ola and Uber. They have been asking for at least basic entitlements. And they have never said, at least as far as India is concerned, the drivers in India, they have never argued that they are employees of these organizations. All that they're saying is fine, you may not consider us as employees of these people, but at least give us certain basic entitlements like minimum wages, social security, etc. So a writ petition was filed before Delhi High Court. Nothing happened. And in fact, some petitioners also withdrew their writ petition. So I don't know if there was any pressure, but they did not pursue the case further. But what the government did is it basically balanced the concerns of both the organizations and these people by saying that we will come up with social security schemes for you guys. We will cover your health, life, disability related risks by coming up with these social security schemes. And the organizations which are engaging you, they will be outside the employer-employee relationship, but they will have to contribute something toward these schemes. Okay, so basically the contribution amount is 1 to 2% of annual turnover. So Ola and Uber will now have to basically deposit 1 to 2% of their annual turnover towards these social security schemes, even though they are not employers of these gig workers or platform workers. Okay, so this is an important development. Obviously, these organizations are angry. And why so? Because it's not only the code on social security which has mandated this. I'm not sure if you're aware of Motor Vehicles Act, but even under Motor Vehicles Act, there are some new guidelines that have been introduced for cab aggregators. Okay, and those guidelines say that the cab aggregators will have to provide health insurance for the cab drivers. So basically, now there is duplicity of obligations. Even under Code on Social Security, they will have to contribute. And even under these other laws like Motor Vehicles Act, they will have to provide life insurance, medical insurance to these drivers. So they are up in arms, obviously, and they feel that this is really going to shoot up their costs of engaging these people. Obviously, one consequence that all of us will be able to see is that once these codes are implemented, these organizations are going to increase their rates, because obviously they would want to pass on their costs to other people, right? So us as customers may see a hit. We may see that the rates will shoot up because of these increased costs that the organizations would have to bear. So this is important. You may see Ola Uber costs increasing after some time. So you will know why that is happening, right? So moving on to the next slide. Yeah, Industrial Relations Code. Now, this code also received the assent of the President on 28 September 2020. And this code basically replaces three central labor laws. One is Industrial Disputes Act, 1947. Then there is Trade Unions Act, 1926. And then there is Industrial Employment Standing Orders Act 1946. I did not discuss the last law in the previous session, but I'll basically touch upon that. I'll try to do that in this particular section. So moving on to the next slide. Yes. So like I said in the previous session, workmen basically includes every employee who is there in the organization, barring persons who occupy a managerial position and persons who occupy a supervisory position and earn wages more than 10,000 rupees per month. Okay. This same concept has also been retained under the codes, under Industrial Relations Code, except that in order to exclude a supervisory level employee, you have to ensure that that person earns more than 18,000 rupees per month. So if I am a supervisor, my job is only to supervise the work of other people, but I'm earning wages only 15,000 rupees, then I will be considered as workman. I will not be excluded from the definition. So if I'm a supervisor and the employer wants to exclude me from the concept of worker, then I will have to be earning more than 18,000 rupees in order to be excluded from the definition. So that is that with respect to the change. It's essentially the same thing, just the number has changed from 10,000 to 18,000 for supervisory employees. And the nomenclature has changed. Earlier, we used to say workman. Now we will be using the word worker. That's all. Then the second important change is with respect to standing orders. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this law called Industrial Employment Standing Orders Act. This law largely applies again to factories, mines, plantations. For service sector establishments, this law is largely not applicable. In this law, what the government has done is it has basically released standing orders, okay, model standing orders, and they basically contain provisions with respect to misconduct. What all activities on the part of the employee can be considered as misconduct. And if you are holding an inquiry into that misconduct, what is the procedure that you need to follow? So model standing orders have to be followed by the employers and factories in addition to whatever is mentioned in their appointment letter, right? So appointment letter may be including certain obligations of employers. Over and above that, they will have to also comply with the standing orders. So this is the existing regime. Now what they've done is they have basically extended the application of standing orders to commercial establishments as well. So even commercial establishments will have to ensure that whatever model standing orders that the government is releasing, they are following those along with other stipulations, other obligations of employer, which are there under the appointment letter. So this is it. Here I will not delve into the obligations under model standing orders. Will not be relevant for you guys. But what is definitely something that you guys should know is that the concept of recognition of trade union has been introduced. So in the previous session, I told you that at the central level, there is no law that talks about recognition of trade union. There is only a law on registration of trade union. And these are two different things. If I'm a registered trade union, basically, there are certain things that I have to keep in mind with respect to the welfare of my trade union members. But if I'm a recognized trade union, I get an inherent right to collectively bargain with the employer. Okay, I can bargain on the wages that the employer wants to pay. I can bargain on the leave entitlements of my members. So that right exists only with respect to a recognized trade union. So far, we only had Maharashtra, Telangana, very few states that have laws regarding trade union recognition. But now the Industrial Relations Code also introduces this concept. So what it basically, and it has a huge, like a really long provision regarding who can be considered as a trade union. So basically, if you have only one trade union in the organization, then that would be considered as a recognized trade union, and it can bargain with the employer. If there there is more than one trade union, then in that case, the one union which has 51% or more worker representation, that will be considered as a recognized trade union. And only that trade union will have the right to collectively bargain with the employer. And if the employer refuses to bargain, then a liability can be imposed on the employer. Okay. Then if there are multiple trade unions, for example, in an organization like the Tatas, Mahindras, there are so many trade unions, and it is possible that none of these trade unions has 51% representation. Then what the code says is that basically in such cases there would be a negotiating council, okay, and that council will consist of trade unions which have the support of 20% workers. So if I have 10 trade unions, and out of that 5 trade unions have 20% recognition, then they will collectively form a negotiating council, and then that council can bargain with the employer. Okay, so this is the idea behind recognition of trade union. Then there is a concept of grievance redressal committee. So far, employers had the option to constitute this committee. They could also do away with, they can just have a grievance redressal mechanism of their own. But now every employer has to formulate a grievance redressal committee. It will have employers as well as workers' representatives, and basically this grievance redressal committee will take care of any grievances which the workers have. It could be regarding wages or any other entitlement. So it's not that every worker has to first approach the grievance redressal committee, and if that committee refuses to take the case, then only they can reach out to conciliation officer and other modes of dispute resolution. No, everything exists in parallel. If I'm aggrieved as a worker, I can approach the grievance redressal committee in my organization, or I can approach the conciliation officer in my region, or I can go for arbitration with my employer. Okay, so all these dispute resolution mechanisms exist in parallel. Okay, so that is the idea. There's a new concept of worker reskilling fund that has been introduced. So if you remember the previous session, I had mentioned that under Industrial Disputes Act, if you are retrenching a workman, basically terminating the services of a workman, you have to pay a retrenchment compensation for the loss of job. So in addition to that retrenchment compensation, the code says that you also need to, as an employer, you also need to contribute towards a worker reskilling fund. So the government will be basically setting up a worker reskilling fund, and whichever employer is removing its employees will have to also contribute towards worker reskilling fund. Whatever amount it is depositing, the government will utilize that amount towards training of the worker that has been removed. Okay, so the idea is that the person who has been removed should immediately get employed somewhere else. So to increase the chances of employability of that worker, they have introduced this concept so that the government has enough funds to train these people. So that's the idea with respect to worker reskilling fund. It's certainly going to increase the cost of the employer, because now they will have to pay retrenchment compensation and also contribute towards worker reskilling fund. So that is that with the Industrial Relations Code. And we'll now move to occupational safety, health, and working conditions. We can move to the next slide also. Yeah. Okay. One thing that you guys should remember out of all these labor codes is the concept of core activity of the establishment. Now, so far, I can engage contract labor for my core activities, for my non-core activities. The law does not prohibit that. Okay, all you need to ensure as a principal employer, as someone who is engaging the services of contract labor, is that there is no supervision and control over these contract labor. So as long as I'm ensuring that, as long as I'm letting the contractor have that supervision and control over contract labor, I can engage these workers in any kind of activity. So for example, if I'm an insurance company, I can engage contract labor not only for ancillary activities like housekeeping. I can also engage contract workers for selling insurance policies, which is my core activity as an insurance company, right? So I can engage contract workers for any activity that I want. Only 2 states have prohibited engagement of contract labor in core activities. These are Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. In these 2 states, I cannot engage contract workers in my core activities. The same concept has now been taken cognizance of by the code. So the code basically defines core activity. It's just a one-line definition. It says any activity for which an organization has been set up and any other activity that facilitates that main activity. So these activities will be called core activities, and contract labor cannot be engaged for core activities. So that is an important thing that you should know. Major change from Contract Labor Regulation and Abolition Act. So yes, there are 3 exceptions where even though I am engaging a core, if I'm engaging a contract worker for my core activity, that can be permitted. So these 3 exceptions are basically: one, industry practice. So if my industry as a whole is accustomed to engaging such contract workers in core activities, and I have evidence to show that there is an industry practice, then I can engage contract workers in my core activities. So taking the same example of an insurance company, if I can demonstrate that all insurance companies have been engaging contract workers for selling insurance policies, then I can avail that exemption and engage contract labor for my core activities. Okay? The second exemption the second exception to the rule is that there is a sudden increase in the volume of work, right? So obviously, if I have gotten a major assignment from one of my clients and I have to complete the entire task in the next week, I cannot, go and hunt for employees. That's going to take a lot of time. I will have to conduct interviews and then ensure that all the HR formalities are done. I don't have time for that. So what will I do? I will reach out to a contractor and say that, look, I need 40, 50 people more for this assignment that I've just gotten from a client. So please send your contract workers to me. So that is an exception that is available. So if there's a sudden increase in the volume of my core activity, then I can engage contract worker in my core activity. Okay? Then there is another exception available. It basically says that if the activity we are talking about, even if it is a core activity, but you do not require a person full-time for that activity, then also I can engage contract labor. So maybe I need someone for packaging purposes. And for that packaging purpose, I do not need permanent employees for the whole of the day. So if my workers are working for 8-9 hours, but I need packing only for packaging activity, is basically a 1 hour duration, and I don't need full-time employees for that, then even if that packaging activity is core to my other activities, it's essential to me, still I can engage contract workers for that particular activity. So these are the 3 exceptions, but if your activity does not fall in any of the 3 categories, you cannot engage contract labor for your core activities. Okay? Second, this is a wonderful concept that has been introduced, which is deemed registration. A lot of times our clients are worried because when they set up a new entity, they have to apply for registration, right? Under Factories Act, under almost all the labor laws, there are provisions for registration, right? So what the code has introduced, it has introduced the concept of deemed registration. So if the rules haven't come yet, but if the rules provide that the authority has to register an establishment within 30 days, and suppose it just sits on the application, doesn't communicate its decision, then it will be deemed after 30-day period that the establishment has been registered. So if the authority wants to reject the application, it will have to communicate that decision within 30 days. I'm just taking 30 days as an example. We'll have to see what the rules provide regarding the timeline. A very, very good provision that has been introduced, and thank God for that now women can be engaged in night shifts. So like I had mentioned, under Factories Act, there is a prohibition after 7 p.m., before 6 a.m., women cannot be engaged in night shifts, right? And I also mentioned that one of the high courts has declared it as unconstitutional, right? So central government took cognizance of that, good sense prevailed, and now they have said that women can be engaged in night shifts. Of course, you'll have to take their consent. It could be in writing or verbally. But of course, you will have to ensure their safety at the relevant time. You will have to comply with certain conditions regarding their security. What would these conditions be? That is not provided under the code. For that, you'll have to wait for the state rules. State rules will provide what all conditions you need to fulfill if you want to engage a woman in night shifts. Last, I think I had mentioned this in the previous session also, that at the moment, the state laws, the shops and establishment laws of certain states have a provision regarding appointment letter. But most of the states do not have this requirement. And even the central laws do not have any requirement regarding having a written appointment letter for your employees. But the code says that for every employee, doesn't matter if that employee is a workman or not, it could be a senior level employee also, but you have to issue a written appointment letter. Now, what will be the contents of this written appointment letter? Again, that has been left to the state government. The state government will provide a format, and you have to issue an appointment letter to every single employee in your organization in accordance with that format. Moving on to the next slide. Also, one more thing regarding health, safety, and welfare measures. Factories Act had detailed provisions regarding health, safety, welfare measures. Those will obviously be provided under this code as well, but not under the substantive part. This again has been left to the central government. This time I'm not using the term state government. I'm saying only central government, because only the central government has been given the power to prescribe health, safety, and welfare facilities that you have to give. So those facilities are not mentioned under the codes. There's just a passing reference given. These standards of health safety will be separately provided by the central government. Okay, so we'll have to wait for that again. Then for contract labor, one change that we already discussed is prohibition, to engage a contract worker in core activity. Another thing is that under the Contract Labor Regulation and Abolition Act, the law becomes applicable the moment you have 20 or more contract workers. Okay. Few states have altered that threshold. For example, in Telangana, they have altered that threshold to 5. So if I have 5 or more contract workers, Contract Labor Regulation and Abolition Act becomes applicable. In West Bengal, the threshold is 10. And in some states, it's even 50, more than 20, So that is that with Contract Labor Regulation and Abolition Act. Under the code, they have fixed the threshold as 50 or more contract workers. States do not have the option to reduce this threshold. We cannot reduce it to 5 or 10. So that's a major advantage for employers. If the employers are engaging only 10 or 20 contract workers, then they can engage them even in core activities, right? Because that chapter on engagement of contract labor under the code, which also contains this prohibition, it applies only when you have 50 or more contract workers. So if I'm engaging only 5 or 10, then I can engage them in core activities also. There's no law that's stopping me from that facility, right? So that is important. 50 or more is the threshold now. Interesting thing here is that every time a contractor receives an assignment, if any organization reaches out to a contractor saying that I need your manpower, then it will have to basically intimate the government authorities that, look, this so-and-so organization has approached me for supplying my contract labor, and here I am notifying it to you. So that intimation requirement has been introduced. So far, that requirement wasn't there. So I may be reaching out to a contractor at midnight saying that tomorrow I need your contract labor, and you could easily have the contract labor supplied to you. But now you will have to first intimate the authorities that you are engaging, that the contractor is sending its contract labor to an organization. So that responsibility has been provided on the contractor, not the principal employer. And last, And I think you guys would agree that interstate migrant worker is probably one of the most important concepts that has gained recognition in the past 1 year because of the entire migrant labor crisis. So let me tell you, so far we do have a law, which is Interstate Migrant Workers Act. Okay, but that law only applies when I am engaging a contract labor from another state. Okay, so my own workers, my own employees from other states will not be called interstate migrant worker. If I'm engaging a contract worker who is from another state, that will be called interstate migrant worker. And this is the reason why so many people are left out of the coverage of this particular statute. So what the code has done is, if any organization is employing its own people also who belong to another state, they will also be called interstate migrant worker. Of course, there is a wage ceiling that has been mentioned, which is 18,000 per month. So if I am from another state, and like, for example, had I been an employee of Khaitan and I come from Madhya Pradesh, right? So I would be an interstate migrant worker if my wages are up to 18,000 rupees. If I'm a senior level employee coming from another state, earning 1 lakh rupees per month, then I'm not an interstate migrant worker. Okay, so do remember two changes. One is that even a direct employee, your own employee, can be an interstate migrant worker now if that person is coming from another state. And second, this provision only applies if you're earning wages up to 18,000 rupees. Okay, so what is a special status given to interstate migrant workers? This is also important. There's only one entitlement that is given, unlike Interstate Migrant Workers Act. Under that act, there was provision regarding giving accommodation. So any person who is engaging an interstate migrant worker, a contract worker, had to provide a reasonable accommodation to these contract workers, basically a place where they can stay when they are working for me. But under the code, that provision has been done away with. There is no obligation on the part of the employer to give any accommodation to an interstate migrant worker. The only extra obligation that you have to comply with for interstate migrant workers is that you have to give a journey allowance to them. So each time they go back to their native state, you will have to pay journey allowance. Not each time. They are planning to just have an yearly allowance, a journey allowance. So in 1 year, I will get a one-time payment, which I can use every time, I'm moving to and from my native state. So that journey allowance is one additional obligation that I have to comply with for my interstate employees. So that is that with all the labor codes. And I think we exceeded by 6 minutes, but I can take up, few questions if the team is fine with that, or if you feel that we should immediately take a break and move to the next session, then you guys can collect all the questions to me, and I'll take them up. I'll respond to them as soon as possible.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much, ma'am, for sharing such interesting concepts with us, especially relating to the definition clauses. So we just have a couple of questions in the chat box. So if you're fine, I'll request Tarun to read it out to you and we can get done with them.
Yeah.
Hello, ma'am. Good afternoon. That we have a few questions from the participants. First of them is, will the code on wages will be applicable on education institute as well?
Will apply to, sorry, who?
Education institute.
Yes, absolutely. So one thing that you need to know about all these codes is that the term employer means any person who is engaged in any industry. And industry means any place where you have a systematic cooperation between the employer and the employee. It's a very wide definition, and even education institutions will be covered. In the definition of industry, only few activities have been excluded, like philanthropic activities. So if I'm engaged primarily in philanthropic activities, then I will be excluded from the definition of industry, and I need not comply with the codes. But barring these one or two minor exceptions, all the organizations would be covered under the codes.
And on second question is regarding that why there is no rules for Employee Compensation Act. Like it was question asked regarding compensation.
So, Employees Compensation Act, which is currently there, that will be replaced by Code on Social Security. There will be a chapter on employees' compensation also. I did not delve into that because most of the provisions remain as is. There is no change, no significant change in the employee compensation chapter. But just to give you some context, if there is any occupational injury that is happening, any occupational disease happening, then the employer is supposed to provide compensation to the worker, and that injury need not happen at the premises. Even if I am undertaking a journey, from the place of work to any other place, during that commute period also, if I suffer from any injury, the employer will have to provide compensation to me. But the important thing here is that the employees who are already covered under employee state insurance chapter, they will not get the benefits under employee compensation chapter for a simple reason that there cannot be duplicity of benefits, right? I'm getting these insurance benefits from state also, and I'm getting these benefits from my employer also. That cannot happen, right? So those people will be excluded who are already covered under employee state insurance chapter. But yes, that compensation requirement is definitely there under Code on Social Security.
One more question that is asked is is overtime compulsory for the employees?
Okay, so overtime, if I talk about Occupational Safety, Health and Working Conditions Code, that code will have, so one of the elements is working conditions, right? So there is a chapter on working hours, compensatory off, all those provisions which I discussed under Factories Act, right? Those are also there under Occupational Safety Code. And there is a provision regarding overtime. And it basically says that if I am engaging a worker overtime, then I will have to pay that person twice the ordinary rate of wages. So here, the important thing to know is the code, Occupational Safety Code, uses both terms, employee and worker. So certain chapters apply only to worker, certain chapters apply to employees, which covers worker also. Okay, so employee is a broader term. It covers both managerial, non-managerial employees, the workman category. It includes every employee. Okay, the definition of worker, like we discussed, it excludes managerial employees. So, for example, appointment letter, right? So issuance of appointment letter, that provision applies for all employees. So I have to issue appointment letter to all my employees, doesn't matter whether they are managerial, non-managerial, workman category, doesn't matter. But the overtime provision applies only for the worker category. So if they are engaged on an overtime basis beyond the normal working hours, then you have to pay overtime to them. But the state governments have been given the power to limit this provision only to certain categories, certain classes of establishments. So it's possible that the state governments may say that this overtime provision applies only to factories, not the service sector establishments. So we have to see what the rules will provide. But yes, overtime provision is there under the code.
My question is from the last last portion of the presentation is regarding that the travel allowance, won't it discourage the employment of interstate migrant laborers? Like as the employees would be required to pay.
I mean, you can say that, but the thing is that in the larger scheme of things, maybe this amount would be a minuscule amount because, like I said, what the government is thinking is that this payment will not be made every time the employee is undertaking a journey. It's only going to be a one-time payment. So every year, maybe 10,000, 15,000 is what the government may provide that you'll have to pay to your interstate migrant employee. So in the larger scheme of things, maybe that 10,000 amount is not significant. But yes, certainly, I mean, covering the normal employees also in that definition is not a very encouraging provision for employers. They're obviously not happy with that. But yes, I don't think that it's going to discourage employment from other states. I don't think that is a significant cost in the larger scheme of things.
Hello? Hello? Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible. You may.
Diksha, good afternoon. This is Jayanam from Global Software Private Limited from HR team.
Yes, sir.
My query is about CLR license renewal parts. Does the employees deputing to client location falls under staffing mode? We are an IT company actually.
Okay.
Usually we depute employees to client location, but they will be under our roles only. Does that the employee falls under staffing mode?
So if I understand your question correctly, you are a staffing agency, right? Like you are the staffing company, you are sending.
No, not exactly. We are an embedded service providers.
Okay.
Okay, we are a software development and testing organization, and we depute our engineers to product companies.
Okay. Yes, sir. So in that case, you may be considered as a contractor under the OSH code because I mean, yes, these people are your own employees. So, but for that other organization, these people will be considered as contract worker.
Okay,
So,
fine. In such case, if earlier we had a CLR license for more than 58 count, and currently if our staffing number 8 count has been reduced for less than 50 numbers, should we go for a renewal?
So once the codes are implemented, you will have the new threshold applicable, which is 50 or more contract workers. So at that point, if you're not having 50 or more people being sent as contract labor, then you do not have to renew your license.
And how about the categorization of a CLR license? Because currently we had based on our service pattern, as we do have for testing for few clients we have for testing development, and for few clients we have an embedded service as a contractor. In such case, should we go for a renewal for only one as per which is registered under labor department with a company Form C, as per Form C? As per Form C, we are registered as a software development organization. Should we go for only one CLR, or should we go for a service expertise categorization as well?
See, one thing that you need to understand is this license that you need to obtain is with respect to a particular establishment. Okay, so if you are sending your contract labor, 50 or more contract workers to one particular entity, then you will be required to obtain license under the code. So for example, if you are sending only 20 contract workers to a particular establishment, then in that case, you will not be supposed to obtain a license. So that basically that provision is applicable, that license will be relevant depending on the number of people that you're deploying to a particular establishment. Just one more thing, for contractors, there's an added provision under the code, which basically says that you can have a common license for engaging, for deputing contract labor, and also for your own organization. So if suppose you are a factory, then you will require a factory license. And if you are sending contract labor to an organization, then you will also require a contractor license. So what the code says is that you can have a common license for working as a factory and for also sending your contract labor to other organizations. So that a single license requirement has also been introduced. So it will ease the compliance on the part of contractors.
Hello. Hello, ma'am. I just want, I have a doubt on annual leave encashment. Whether is it applicable to employees with like more than 15,000 salary, ma'am? Because according to the code, there is two definitions: workers and employee.
Yes.
And but when you consider the leave annual leave encashment, it is mentioned as worker alone. It is not mentioned employee. So I have a doubt whether it is applicable to employee or worker alone, ma'am.
So Raghu, you're absolutely on point that that provision with respect to annual leave encashment, it's only applicable to workers. And like I said, worker would mean an employee who is not in managerial position or who is not in a supervisory position earning more than 18,000 rupees. So that 18,000 is only for supervisory. Okay. So if I'm a worker who is in a non-supervisory position and I may be earning 25 or even 30,000 rupees, then also I will be considered as a worker. That 18,000, the threshold is only applicable for supervisory level employees. So if I'm a supervisor and earning more than 18,000, then I would be excluded from the definition of worker. Likewise, if I'm a managerial employee, doesn't matter what my salary is, I will be outside the purview of worker. So the remaining bucket of employees would be workers, and for them, there is this provision regarding annual leave encashment. Whatever balance leaves there are at the end of each year, they can cash them out every single year.
I think we've exceeded 20 minutes by the time frame. So I thank all of the participants for the questions. And if any of your questions are still unanswered, you can send it in the chat box and we can request Diksha ma'am to take it in the next session. So now we'll be taking a short break of 15 minutes. I request everyone to not leave the meeting because this is the same link for the second session as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ishan.